This conference will now be recorded.
Good to have everybody back again today. This is the second in our series of Your Land and the Long View, working with farmers to protect your investment, reaching out to landowners and people who work with landowners. And I shared a few things last week about this whole topic, more from a farmer's perspective. And I think it's a great balance here today to have Sarah from the University of Maryland. She'll introduce herself. I want to say that Stroud Water Research has also helped to pull this off. So just a good organization to help educate and get the word out about soil health, water conservation, and all that stuff. So Sarah, I'm turning it over to you. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. The title of today's presentation is Win-Win Strategies and Tools. Tell you a little bit about myself and the organization I work for, and then we'll go ahead and dive into it. I work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative. It's a University of Maryland program. It's a collaborative program made up of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the College of Ag and Natural Resources at the University of Maryland College Park, and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. So we are a group of lawyers. We cover the entire state, here to help all different types of agricultural producers with legal issues that they face. If you've never checked out our website, I encourage you to do so. It's umaglaw.org. That's where we house all of our legal publications. There's a link on our website to the Maryland Risk Management Education blog, which is a blog we write for and update a couple times a week. Try to stay active on social media, and I will give you my contact information at the end. If anyone has any questions about any facet of agricultural law, I'll be talking about leasing today, but we handle the gamut. I help folks with labor issues, environmental compliance, all different types of issues. So please be in touch with us. We're happy to, when we're able, to physically come out and meet with folks. And where we are right now, since we can't come out and meet with people in person, we're happy to participate in webinars like I'm doing this evening. One little thing I wanted to alert you to, at the Agricultural Law Education Initiative, we have an annual agricultural and environmental law conference. It's our big event every year. We really look forward to it. This year, we're turning it into a webinar series. So it's going to be going on for 3 weeks in November, November 2nd, 9th, and 16th. It's going to be going on in the late afternoon from 2 to 4. So there'll be 2 different topics each day. It will be free of charge. We're hoping to be able to qualify for some credits. Perhaps nutrient management credits, don't have that finalized yet, but we're working on it. And here's some of the proposed topics. Quite a few things about the Chesapeake Bay cleanup, things of interest to Maryland and Pennsylvania producers. We always have a developing topics panel. That's one of our more popular panels, kind of tell you what happened this year. I know this is a difficult year to follow the news cycle because there's so many things going on. So we'll give you an update about what happened in the past year and then things you should look out for in the coming year. So registration will be open soon. Keep an eye on our website for that. Have to give a disclaimer. I am an attorney. I'm not here today to provide legal advice. I was in private practice for 9 years in the state of Maryland, so I did provide legal advice for quite a few years. Now I'm just an academic, so I'm just here to provide education. If anyone needs a referral to an attorney, I'm happy to try to help you do that through the Ag Law section of the Maryland State Bar Association. All right, let's get into it. So things we're going to cover today, common impediments to conservation. And I should say right out of the gate, like Steve said, please stop me. Go ahead and type in the chat box and Jen and Steve can help alert me to that. If you have a question, I'm happy to be stopped. If you don't understand something or you want me to slow down, just let me know. So we're going to be talking about some common impediments to conservation, how to communicate with your farmer or your landowner. I know Steve talked about that a bit last week. That's something we're going to be continuing to talk about throughout this series just because of how important it is. This is an issue that really cannot be dealt with unless the farmer and the landowner are on the same page. So you'll be hearing a lot about communication throughout. And then today I'm going to be talking about how to develop a simple lease that's going to help you achieve common conservation goals. I do not advocate for leases that people don't understand. I don't think leases have to be overly complicated. A lease should be something that anyone can read and understand what it means. It's really just about putting your handshake agreement down on paper, because we all know memories fade, and that's where conflicts can occur. So really the goal of all of this is to maintain that farmer landowner relationship. Most folks I talk to are happy with their farmer. They don't want to rock the boat. Perhaps on the landowner side, they're interested in conservation and they're not really quite sure how to start that conversation, but they always tell me, but I don't want to lose my farmer. I don't want to upset my farmer. And that's the last thing that we want to happen also. So when I talk to farmers about this and they seem a little hesitant, I try to tell them, look, getting into a lease, if you don't have a written lease, because many folks have had handshakes over the years, maybe that's how everybody in their families operated, it's to prevent conflict, to prevent folks from getting into a disagreement. I did include a link here, it's a hyperlink to the first webinar in case you missed it. I will refer to it a little bit throughout today. I don't want to bore people who weren't able to tune in last week. I'm happy to email this presentation to anybody after the fact, so you can go ahead and click on that link, and then I'm sure Jen can also share the link with you. All right, so conservation practices in general are less prevalent on leased land. That is something we know. It's not something that we have a great deal of empirical data on. We know how much land is leased, and nationally and in my home state of Maryland, it's about 40%. So it's a good amount of land. And so this is a real issue of concern. When I try to attack a problem like this, I like to put myself in both parties' shoes. So why? What's the breakdown here? Why are these practices something that we see on a farmer's home acres, but not leased acres? Lack of communication is always something we hear. You know, it may be that a landowner is out of state. It may be that a landowner just doesn't want to engage with the farmer, maybe doesn't have the time to engage with the farmer, maybe doesn't have the knowledge to be able to engage with the farmer. And then we hear from a lot of farmers who are perfectly happy not to be in constant communication with landowners either. They're busy, they got a lot to do, they have a lot of acres to manage, and they'd rather just carry on doing what they're doing without communication. So lack of communication can be a real problem. Leasing uncertainty, and that's sort of a general term that encompasses a lot of different ideas. When I say leasing uncertainty, I'm talking about maybe you don't know how long your lease is going to be for. If you have a handshake lease, you don't know. In some cases, like in our state, you have to give 6 months notice. So you never know if your lease is going to be carrying on from year to year, and that can be a real problem. Maybe you're not sure if the landowner has certain standards that he expects or she expects you to be farming to. So what are the standards? What do they expect you to be doing on the property? If you're a landowner, if you expect your farm to be doing certain things, but that's not in a lease, there's uncertainty there. And then return on investment. Conservation practices are not an overnight thing. They take time. They take years sometimes before we can see the positive impacts. So there's uncertainty with how conservation practices are going to impact the overall operation. Lack of knowledge of farming practices and conservation practices. So this can come into play on the landowner side. Say someone just inherits a piece of property, or maybe they're just, you know, they don't have a lot of knowledge about farming in general or conservation practices. In those cases, they're probably relying, and we hear from folks, relying on their farmer to drive this conversation. You know, they hire the farmer because of the farmer's expertise. So the farmer is going to have to be the one who's driving the conservation practice train, so to speak, because the landowner just doesn't have the information to even start the conversation. Sometimes there's some intimidation factor there too. Maybe they have some feelings about farming practices, but they don't feel like they have a good enough base of knowledge to kind of kick off the conversation. So all of that is to say, how can a lease help? I think of a lease as a tool in this process. So we have this lack of communication, we have leasing uncertainty, we have sometimes a knowledge deficit between the two parties. A lease can be a tool. It can be a tool to support your business if you're a farmer, no doubt, but it can also be a tool to support conservation practices. It can really establish a foundation. It can give a farmer assurance and certainty that they need to be able to lead that conversation about conservation practices and to set up conservation practices on leased acres in a mutually beneficial way. So anytime I'm thinking about a lease or a contract in general, I think a good contract, a good lease is a fair one. Both people have to be giving a little bit, getting a little bit. If it's totally one-sided, it's not going to be a good legal document. So thinking about a way that this can be done where ultimately the land benefits, but it's also done in a fair way to the two parties. So with all that in mind, we got some grant funding from SARE, the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, which we're very fortunate to have received, and we're actually in the third year of this grant. And along with my partners at the Hughes Center for Agroecology, we went ahead and created this resource. It's called the Agricultural Conservation Leasing Guide. It is geared toward Maryland producers, but if you're not a Maryland producer, I think there's still a lot that you could get out of it. You can find it on our website, that Ag Law website. And it really breaks down the who, the what, and the how of conservation on leased farmland. So we wanted to make this document something that would be useful for a landowner who just inherited a piece of farmland and has absolutely no idea about farming and conservation, all the way to a 70-year-old farmer who's been farming his whole life. So we started with the who. Now a farmer probably already knows these things, but that non-operating landowner might not. So we explain who all these folks are. We all know in agricultural and environmental circles, we love our acronyms. They can make some people's heads spin, give people headaches, and I don't want to do that. So we walk through who all these people are: extension, folks on the federal level, NRCS, the soil conservation districts, and environmental nonprofits, and how they all play a part in putting conservation practices on farms. And then what strategies you can use, leasing strategies and communication strategies, because frankly, some people, like I said, have always operated on a handshake and they're going to continue to do so. I'm never going to convince them that a written lease is better for them. If those two people communicate, if they're the landowner and the farmer are able to talk to each other, able to shake hands, and if they're able to, that's what works for them and gets conservation on the farm, that works for me too. So there's plenty of strategies for both routes, depending on how you want to go. And then what we did is we broke down the most common conservation practices and provided some considerations and sample lease language that folks can use in their individual leases. We have general leasing resources on the ALEI website that anyone can take a look at and take advantage of. And this was really sort of a 2.0 to not just a general lease, but if I have a specific practice, if I really want to sort of up my conservation game and I want to refer to specific practices, I can use this document as a way to do that. Okay, so we've done the who, the what, and the how. Now, how do we actually do this? How do you structure a lease to support conservation? Well, again, I'm a broken record. Start with communicating. You have to assess your goals and your priorities, and you also have to put yourself on the other person's shoes. So it's really a two-part communication exercise. I'm going to talk to you about considering alternative forms of leases. If the only type of lease you've ever used is a fixed cash rent lease, and you're thinking about implementing some conservation practices, it might be something to consider to think about a crop share or a flex cash lease. Consider the impact of the length of the lease. After we created the Conservation Leasing Guide, we did a series of workshops throughout the state. We invited ag service providers, landowners, and farmers, and we were surprised the amount of landowners whose eyes really opened when we were able to explain to them the impact of a short lease and what that really meant to their farmer and how just by giving their farmer a couple of extra years, I'm not talking about a 20-year lease, I'm talking about a 3 to 5 year lease, giving that farmer a couple extra years, what impacts that was able to make and that foundation it was able to build. Setting farming standards. I would not assume that there is going to be underlying law in your jurisdiction that's going to have good enough baseline, good husbandry standards for you to rely upon. Some states have an implied covenant of good husbandry, and what that means is, in layman's terms, that just means in some states it says in the law what being a good farmer means. In other states, it doesn't say anything at all. And I think it would be very challenging if you ended up in a courtroom having to explain to a judge that you want to terminate a lease, that you want to get rid of a farmer who's farming land because they didn't do certain conservation practices that you assume are sort of the norm of what a good farmer would be. So everyone is much better served to have that conversation up front, to put those standards in a written document. Considering adjusting rent to reflect investment or impacts on yield, we'll talk about that. Compensation for maintenance. So I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of farmers about this project, and I heard repeatedly from folks that maintenance of conservation practices can end up to be a real headache for farmers and something that they sort of get stuck with, something that's often an uncompensated burden, and a reason that they would shy away from initiating this type of conversation with the landowner. So I think thinking about that right at the forefront would be best for everybody. If there's going to be maintenance, who's going to do it, and how are we going to compensate them for the time and effort they're going to spend doing that? And then finally, addressing the specific practices in the lease. So, kickstarting communication. So I thought about this, and I wanted to have a little bit of a conversation about this based on some questions that were raised in the last webinar about, okay, all well and good, Steve, Sarah, you guys tell us to communicate, yada, 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 but what does that really mean? How do I actually have that conversation? How do I begin? What do I say? I think if you're a farmer, a good place, one option, and obviously this is not going to be, one size fits all for everybody, but depending on your relationship, I think a good thing to maybe start the conversation would be, what are your future plans for the farm? We all know there's a lot of variation with farm landowners. Some people see it, as a family heritage issue. They want children, grandchildren to inherit the farm, live on the farm, enjoy the farm. They maybe got it from someone in their family, so carrying that on as a legacy is extremely important. Other people may be planning to sell the farm and retire to Florida in 5 years. Unless you ask the question, you don't really know. And I've had some tough talks with farmers who have been caught very much off guard, thinking that the landowner, that everything was fine and hunky-dory, and that maybe someday they would have a conversation with the landowner about maybe being able to buy those acres themselves since they'd spent many, many years farming them, only to, have a very unwelcome surprise when the landowner makes a quick move or passes away, and then there's no conversation, there's no ability to have that communication. So I think it'd be a good idea to just say, what are your plans? If a landowner has long-term plans for the farm, that's a great way to start the conversation about conservation. If they have a short-term plan for the farm, then we'll talk about some other strategies and some other things that farmers can do. For the farmer, if you're a landowner and maybe, you're at a knowledge deficit, or maybe you're not, either way, I think a good thing one way to start the conversation is just to say, is there anything about the farm that you think could be improved with some conservation practices? A farmer, regardless if it's his or her own farm or a leased farm, they're going to know that land. So they're going to know where the issues lie. They're going to know if there's, we've had wild weather the last couple of years. So farmers have been able to observe all types of conditions So they're going to see if you're having excess runoff, probably going to know a lot more about the soils than you are as a landowner. So I would start it there, and see where that conversation goes. To get a little bit more specific, and again, in the conservation leasing guide, we get into, there's a lot more detail, but just to kind of give you a broad overview, if these types of communication strategies appeal to you, I would definitely take a look at that part of the guide. But again, this is sort of repetitive of the last one. How could conservation practices benefit the land? And these are questions to ask yourself and the other party. So I think these questions both people could be asking of themselves and the other party. And a conservation plan could be a great way to start that conversation. So do you have is there a current conservation plan for the farm? If there's not, updating it might be a great way to have the conversation. Hey, ask the farmer, do you remember if we have a conservation plan, or maybe the landowner has one? Take a look at it, see how old it is, see if it needs updating, and then seek help from your professionals. There's a lot of people, around whose job it is to help. I know the Soil Conservation District folks, Extension folks, they're used to dealing with these issues, and they're starting to get these questions more and more. So if you think a third party would help, that's definitely something that you should consider. What impact is this going to have on my bottom line? So depending on who you are in this equation, there's going to be different impacts, but obviously farming is a business, and you're going to need to think about the impacts on the bottom line. What are you willing to contribute? So I talked about making it fair and equitable. So that means that parties are going to have to give a little bit. Sometimes, people kind of get pigeonholed and think, well, prices are down this year. It's been a tough year for everybody. This is not the year that I want to be asking anybody to give anything financial. Doesn't always have to be, right off the bottom line. It can be something like sharing and cost share. And if you're a landowner, you've got some non-monetary choices as well. How about extending that term? How about having a conversation with your farmer? Hey, things are tight right now. And it's not a great year, but I like what you're doing. I want to stick around. I want to review what's going on the farm, and let's talk about if we can come to an agreement on this. And if we can, I can give you a 5-year lease on the farm, so at least you'll know you'll be here for years to come. How can we make both the implementation and the maintenance equitable? And if it matters, is it in the lease? So again, if all of this matters, if you want that farmer to be following that conservation plan, if you have reached a handshake agreement about a deal regarding a practice, if it matters, put it in writing. It's going to save both of you in the long run. Type of the lease. So like I was saying before, a lot of folks are operating under a fixed cash rent lease. Not everybody, but a lot of folks are. Conservation practices, depending on what we're talking about, and I use that term pretty broadly, to encompass a lot of best management practices, but they can present some risks to profitability depending on what we're talking about. So a crop share or a flex cash lease, it might be the more appropriate lease if you're trying to allocate some risk. And I think it would go a long way to show that you appreciate the risk if you're proposing something like this. And if there's going to be any kind of hit on profit, you would both be experiencing that. We've got model crop share and flex cash leases on our website, so you can definitely check those out. Length of the lease, it's just, we can't say that enough, that short leases discourage conservation practices. I think there's been a lot of interest in this particular topic in the last 10 or so years, and I think it's building. We're going to continue to see more, and I'm going to point you towards at the end some more scholarly work on this if you want to dive in and see what some scientists and researchers have put together on this topic. But I think everybody can agree that short leases discourage conservation practices because farmers are just not given that long-term interest in the land. So they're not going to stick their neck out. They're not going to spend their own money putting a lot of inputs or fancy practices, expensive practices in. And this is not a quick thing with these conservation practices. It's just not going to give the assurance. All right, so what do? Right? It's easy for me to say. I know people don't like long-term leases, landowners especially. I understand that. So longer leases create incentives, but they present issues of obligation for the landowner, right? So landowners, important for them to understand that they get benefits. They're gonna get a better investment from their farmer, and they're probably gonna get healthier soils. But they may have, if they're planning, if they're that type B landowner that they don't have a family that, this farm is not a family legacy, this farm is how they're gonna fund their retirement down in Florida. And so they wanna be able to sell this farm in the next couple of years. They might not want a farmer with a long lease because that might chill a future sale, especially if they're planning on selling the farm, for development, that type of thing. If it's in an area where the farm's going to sell for high dollar because it's going to be turned into rolling acres estate subdivision, they don't want a farmer who's going to potentially muck up that deal, right? And they also worry about inability to renegotiate terms. So you sign a contract now, you don't know what the prices are going to look like in the future. Some of that can be ameliorated with the flex cash lease system, which provides you some flexibility, but there are drawbacks that are definitely worth considering. So what are some solutions to that? These are some sort of reactions to that, alternatives to a longer term, to just a straight longer term. Sometimes you can establish a longer term, but reserve a future right to renegotiate the rent. So this would be something that would need some careful drafting from your attorney, but if this is something that you'd be interested in, talk to your attorney about this and say, here's my issue. I want to give my farmer assurance. I want a longer term, but I'm worried about fluctuations in the prices of the commodities. So I want, some options there. Including a renewal provision can allow for a longer lease, but doesn't mandate a longer term. So again, that's something that your attorney can help you put in your lease. A renewal provision can be a pretty helpful tool. I've looked at plenty of farm leases that are from the 90s that have just continued to renew and renew and renew over time. So people sometimes let these things go for a long time, too long in some cases. There's some other things too that that's options if when you have that conversation with the landowner and they say, yeah, my plan is to eventually sell the farm, but that's down the road. I don't have a timetable or a real idea when that's going to happen. That's how I'm going to fund my retirement, but I don't know when I'm going to retire. We hear that all the time. A right of first offer is something that you can give the farmer, ask them if they'd be interested in that. It's going to give them the opportunity to purchase the property before a landowner offers it to third parties. So this would help in the situation where I was talking about, I get an angry call from a farmer that says, they listed the farm and it sold right away. I didn't even have time. I didn't even have any idea. He had told me before over the fence that if he ever listed it, he'd let me know. And now I've lost this farm that I thought I would one day own. Instead of having that happen, talk to your attorney about a right of first offer. This is something that would need to be drafted, but it's not overly complicated. In the case of a farm, a farmer would need adequate time to get lending together in most cases so that they would have an opportunity to purchase. But it's something that an experienced land use attorney should be able to put together for you. And a right of first refusal, similar, but it gives the opportunity to the farmer to match an offer made to purchase the farm. So again, giving that farmer the opportunity. These are things that, these are this isn't going to cost the landowner anything. If their goal is to sell the farm, take the money and retire, they wouldn't care if they get the same price from the farmer or from a third party, right? So things to consider, definitely points of conversation that can help people. All right, so how are we going to farm? how are you going to define your standards of good husbandry? What is good farming? It's going to be a different answer for different people, right? I can't give you a definition for good farming. That's really something that the parties are going to have to work out for themselves. It would definitely change depending on where you are in the country, depending on what kind of farm you're talking about. You know, in Maryland, it's very common for people to use cover crops, use reduced tillage. However, if that's not in your lease, like I said before, and you end up in legal conflict, that is going to be a very difficult reason to terminate a lease and get rid of that farmer. So if a farmer doesn't use cover crops, tills the heck out of the field, you know, a judge is going to say, did they pay their rent? Okay, well, what's the problem? I don't see a breach. And as the landowner, you could potentially see some damage to the farm that, you know, if it's not in writing, very, very difficult to enforce. So be specific. Be as specific as you feel is appropriate. If you feel that certain practices like cover crops, like reduced tillage, if you feel that's good farming, put that in the lease. Maybe it's even more specific. We've got acres in Maryland that are subject to phosphorus limitations. And so, you know, if a farmer is farming leased acres that are subject to very precise phosphorus limitations, that sort of specificity should be something that's in a lease, right? What practices does that farmer need to do or not do? Not use certain inputs that are going to then increase phosphorus levels to a point in the soil where it's going to take years to bring them down and limit what then can be done on that farm. So this is going to be a case-by-case thing that you're going to need to evaluate and, you know, talk to your experts about how to form these standards, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Here's some examples, and, you know, these are just things to sort of get your mind working. These are not plug and play. These are just some examples of some very broad language that you can make more specific for your situation. So tenant shall follow farming best practices of the State Department of Agriculture or your county soil conservation district. You know, depending on what state you're in, if that might work for you, that might not. Tenant shall, to the maximum extent possible, implement best management practices from the farm conservation plan. So if you have a current conservation plan, and if that's something that you and the farmer have discussed, the conservation plan is good, it's up to date, you both agree with the recommendations in it, reference it in the lease. It can be that simple. I would attach a copy of it to the lease, and then you're both on the same page about what the expectations are. Considering the costs is important, as I said. So a lot of times, you know, it's pretty easy to think about the initial implementation and construction costs. And if you go the cost share route, you know, those numbers are going to be, you know, numbers that both parties are going to think about right at the outset. How much is this thing going to cost us? But you also have to think about, are we taking land out of production? What's that going to do to the profit? What's it going to cost to maintain it? And then, like I said, how are we going to address this in the lease? Are we going to discount rent? Are we going to share a program payment? And by that, I mean a cost share payment. Are we going to engage in some non-monetary benefits, like a longer lease? So I throw these out there for your consideration again. So just some samples. To compensate tenant for the time and expenses contributed towards the creation of fill-in-the-blank conservation practices, you can discount the rent by a certain amount or by a certain percentage in a year, or you could do, like the second example there, reducing it by a larger amount, 15% right at the outset, and then diminishing that by 5% each year until you're back to your full rental payment. So just optional ways to handle it. We found when we did our workshops on this topic and we're continuing to talk with people, we get a lot of questions about, all right, so there's these cost share, you know, cost shares out there. It can definitely help with the initial implementation costs of this, but how do we go about splitting these payments? How do we actually structure cost share between these two parties, it seems like, that could be another place where conflicts could occur. We had a webinar specifically on this topic, so you can find it there at that web address. Go UMaryland Conservation Leasing, and you can hear on that webinar how parties can participate in commonly used programs, some recent updates specifically applicable to the landlord-tenant setting, and some common pitfalls to avoid. So I'd really recommend checking out that resource if splitting cost share is something you're interested in. Don't forget about the tax obligations. No one likes a tax surprise. I think we can all agree on that. So keep in mind that if you end up applying for cost share, and in most cases, the landowner is going to be the one applying for the cost share. So if it's, if the farmer is sort of running point on the conservation practice idea, and advocating for that practice, which is great, and gets the landowner to go in and sign up for the cost share payment, just keep in mind that it's also going to mean some tax obligations for that landowner, because they're probably going to get a 1099 for that cost share funding, and you want to have that conversation up front to avoid that unwelcome surprise. Good news is that the payment may ultimately be excludable from their income tax obligations, and there's conservation expense deductions available. Farmers often have a very good handle on all of these deductions. Landowners may not. So don't assume that your landowner is accustomed to these issues, especially if they're a new agricultural landowner. So we put together a publication called Navigating Tax Issues When Leasing Farmland. Again, it's available on that Conservation Leasing site. So hopefully that's something that will help folks. Take a look at that, and don't forget to talk to the landowner about that. Okay, so you've communicated, you've got the money figured out. Now, how do we actually put this in the lease? Steve talked about this at the last webinar, and I think it's important to keep in mind that the landowner may or may not know exactly what you're talking about. So if the landowner uses that prompt that I provided, hey farmer, how could the farm be improved? What issues do you see on the farm? Do you think there's anything we could do to improve those issues? If the farmer starts talking about conservation tillage, the landowner may or may not know. So, break it down, explain what conservation tillage is and how you're using that term, what it's encompassing, and talk about the benefits, how that practice is going to help those issues on the farm. What would having that type of tillage in the lease, let's say, how would that help the farm? How would that improve the land? The landowner is going to want ultimately the land to be improved. That will benefit them. Hopefully it would ultimately end up being more valuable farmland. So explain to them how it's going to improve the soil, what it's actually going to do. And I think Steve did a good job explaining how to have some of those conversations last time. Again, put yourself in each other's shoes. So if you're a landowner and you've been tuning in here and you feel pretty confident that you want to have this conversation with your farmer, and I think the best thing to do is actually go forth with a pretty in-depth conversation. Don't just, I would not think it's a good idea to put a bunch of specific practice language and requirements in a lease and then hand it to your farmer and say, sign it, or I'll go find another farmer. Think about whether the farmer is willing to adopt these practices. Does the farmer have the necessary equipment? Is the field suitable for reduced till or no-till? Maybe you've read about no-till or heard about no-till, educated yourself and think, no-till's the best. I've heard cover crops and no-till, that's the way to go. That's what I'm going to do, so that's what I'm going to force my farmer to do. It might be better to start as a reduced tillage situation and phase till no-till. That might be the most beneficial thing to the farm. Consider that the farmer's going to have to make other adjustments. There's going to be potentially disease and weed management issues. And so there's going to be implications for the farmer. And I think it's really important for both parties to take that into account. Here's some sample language for conservation tillage, just an example of, tenant in consultation with the Soil Conservation District, NRCS, State Department of Ag. You could cut some of those out if those aren't bodies that you typically deal with. Shall reduce tillage as much as possible in accordance with the Farm Conservation Plan. And then if you want to get specific, shall maintain at least a certain percentage, such as 30% residue cover on the ground surface at planting. It's specific. It might be too specific for you, but it's pretty clear. And clarifying goals and expectations is ultimately what we're going for. Cover crops, we've been talking about cover crops during the last webinar, very important conservation practice. So explain again to the landowner, what is this? Why do we need to get into cover crops? What do they do? How could they help the farm? Think about some considerations. So, and in Maryland, this might be a little simpler, but don't take it for granted. Even in our state where we have a very robust state cover crop cost share program, I still hear from farmers all the time that if they get a new landowner or a landowner buys a piece of farmland and they're new to ag, they hear a farmer getting, they hear about a farmer getting a check for cover crops, and they can have a very skewed impression with what that means. They think it's, some kind of extra money that they weren't informed about. It just causes problems. So have the conversation about, all right, you want me to enroll in the cover crop program, or hey, I've always used I've used cover crops for the last 10 years. I'm planning on enrolling in the program. If I enroll in the program, am I going to keep all of the money, or do you want to know how much I'm spending on the cover crops? Are we going to divide that payment? Who's going to pay for the seed, labor, equipment if the payments are inadequate to cover the costs? So I know our payment this year in Maryland went down a little bit because of all the budgetary cuts. So, and what are we going to do when the cover crops are done growing? Are they going to be suppressed? Are they going to be used for livestock? So again, this is just a sample, and I'll wrap up here because I want to leave time for questions. But tenants encouraged to plant a fall cover crop. If the tenant's given the cost share funding, they should have the right to all the cost share funding. If it does not completely offset the cost, the tenant shall be responsible for the overages. Maybe that's how the landowner wants to handle it. Maybe the landowner says, you apply for the cost share funding, you handle the cover crop, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Or maybe they want to be a bit more involved and equitable and say, hey, apply for that program payment, and if the costs exceed what you get, we'll split it. I like to say in near equal shares because it's annoying to have to do things exactly equal. So in near equal shares to cover the deficit, to allow that farmer, to have, it's just, it's kind of a safety net there. Okay, I'm going to do this cover crop thing. I'm going to try to get as much of that state or federal funding as I can, but you'll be there for me and help me share the costs if there's unforeseen costs. So here are some other resources, and again, I know this is a lot of wording on a slide. I'm happy to email this to people, but there's been some really outstanding work done in the Midwest. The Nature Conservancy has done a lot of work on this, so you can see some more empirical data from studies they've done. And there's been law review articles on this that you can read if you're so inclined. And I wanted to mention there's also a survey that's currently out right now from the Nature Conservancy. It's for both landowners and farmers to take. Shouldn't take very long to complete. And again, it's the point of it is that the Nature Conservancy has more information so that they can have the same kind of information they have on this issue, why conservation practices are less common. They have that in the Midwest, and they want to have that kind of information on the Delmarva so that they can help folks overcome those challenges. Please tune in next week. Steve and I are going to bring it all together. We're going to talk about some troubleshooting type issues. We're going to talk about, some other points along the way of this process that we haven't focused on yet. So tune in next week. We're going to have it be a little bit more conversational. So we'll definitely be looking to answer questions. But speaking of questions, I'm ready for questions now, if anyone has any. And here's my contact information if anyone wants to contact me.
So one question that came up earlier, I think you addressed it to do with farming standards. And I think it comes into play, especially if someone isn't maybe as versed on farming practices, but still wants to cover their bases in terms of, does the use of the term good agricultural practices remove some ambiguity? So you talked about naming specific practices in the lease. And so I wondered if you can address, is there a particular phrase or something that would kind of cover the general idea and the intent that you're trying to get to there?
I think that perhaps it would, and I think that's a good suggestion if you were talking about fruit and vegetable production. Something like good agricultural practices, or saying USDA harmonized good agricultural practices, or if your state has their own good agricultural practices program, referencing that. Yeah, that's a great idea for that type of farming. I think that's a good idea. I think being as specific as possible and using plain English is the best course of action. When people try to use legal terms, even when lawyers sometimes try to use legal terms, it can cause problems. So you should be able to read it and understand it. And judges appreciate it too, trust me.
Yeah, Sarah, this is Steve. I really appreciate your well done topic here. That's great. I do have a question for you.
Sure.
In your work with this here, just curious, what we talk about the advantages, the desire to have longer term leases. What do you see out there? What is typical in I'm going to call it a conservation situation where there is agreement to both sides. We want to deploy some of these practices. Is it 3 years? Is it 5, 10? I mean, what do you see as an average, just to help us know what the reality actually is?
I mean, for the people that haven't really kind of gone to this place, I still see, handshakes and year to year. For the people that have thought about conservation and, have gone through this and thought about what's best for their land, 3 to 5, I think, is great. I mean, 5 is wonderful. I think 5 is an ideal amount. I mean, it's, 5 years goes by in a flash. And I think most people would probably be pleasantly surprised with what they found after 5 years. I know a lot of landowners, have the same farmer for decades. So 5-year lease might seem a little scary at the outset, but I think it's definitely something worth trying. I mean, thinking about the lifespan of some of these practices, they're going to be more than 5 years, right? So it's
Absolutely.
not, if you weren't really being, I guess, realistic or in touch with the community, you'd probably say, well, just match the lease to the lifespan of the practice. But I think I'm never going to sell anybody on 10 to 15-year farming leases. But I think 5 would definitely be a good place to start.
Yeah, that's good. That's just helpful for, for anybody new to this, trying to be in the ballpark, so to speak.
Right.
I'll just say, is there any other questions that are out there? You can feel free to type or speak up now. So I see David Ross asked a question here in the chat. Sarah, what percentage of farmland is leased? I know that varies from geographical area to geographical area, but
right.
What's your thoughts?
Nationally and in the state of Maryland, it's about 40%.
Okay.
40% is the safe ballpark. That's typically where we see things shake out.
It's a lot. That's a huge number. Yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah. And like you said last time, we have a lot of excellent farmers who have great BMPs on their home farm and not lease farm. And it's sort of what we're trying to help people sort of get at that, why is that and what can we help you do change that? Because you obviously see a value in it. And I mean, and that might be would be an interesting question for a landowner to start the conversation with your farmer. Well, if they have, homemakers, well, what do you have on your farm? Have you tried this on your farm? And if they have, I think that would be worthwhile to explore.
Are you seeing more, I'm going to call it absentee landowners or non-farming landowners? Are you seeing an uptick on their openness to conservation practices?
Yes, well, we have seen a lot more landowner interest than we anticipated when we began this project. So, we got the grant funding, so we had to set some estimated goals with how many landowners would be interested, and the landowners have far exceeded what we thought. So, and that was another reason that we sort of dove into this, is because we were getting calls from our partners at Extension and at NRCS saying, I'm getting these landowners calling and saying, I bought a farm, or I inherited a farm, or, and I want to do this right. What do I do? How do I start? I don't want to kick the farmer off that's there, but I just want to sort of take a holistic view and, really kind of understand the impact of the practices and what's going on and what my options are. So I think there's a lot of interest. I think that can probably be positive and negative for farmers sometimes. I mean, there's farmers who, sort of start to get a headache when landowners read an article or see something, and then they get, some ideas about what can be done on the farm, and maybe there needs to be some education there. But I think in general, it's really positive.
Other questions from anyone? Any other perspectives? Anything? Go ahead.
When you talked about the type of leases before, is a crop share and a flex lease the same thing?
No, those are different concepts. So with a crop share, a landowner is sharing in costs, and then they're really sharing, and then, depending on how it's formulated, so they're going to share on seed costs, input costs, and then the parties literally share in the profits. And, they're going to decide on a percentage. A flex lease is more like a hybrid of a fixed cash lease, where you have a base fee for the acre, you have that flat fee, but then that fee can be adjusted based on grain prices, or other sort of fixed things that you decide on. So there's a really good recent blog post about this on the Maryland Risk Management Education blog that gives you some really solid examples of how to formulate a flex cash lease, but that's really the difference between the two. So the crop share, the landowner's a lot more involved. It's kind of more like a partnership. And the flex cash is more of an economic index based, where, a farmer gets some assurance about what the rent's going to be, but in a year like this, if they end up getting a lot less a bushel, let's say, than they thought they were going to, then the rent will be reduced by a certain amount.
Other questions or comments from anyone? I think we did pretty good, Sarah. We almost filled up the hour, but wanted to give everybody a chance here. So anything to add?
Yeah, and feel free to contact me. That's my number there and my email. That's my job, so I'm happy to anybody. And this program and this whole project is definitely evolving, and it's very much benefited from input from other people, from landowners, from farmers, from ag service providers. So, don't be shy. Let me know if you think there's ways I can improve it.
Well, you're doing a great job, Sarah. I appreciate it, because, I'm kind of in my little world, and we need people like you to to kind of have that other side there of the legal side, and you have a bigger picture, I feel, because you're involved in a little bit more. It was really helpful for me to hear some of the things that you shared, and just from my personal efforts of trying to help move get into more cover crops and soil health practices. You know, you're just adding to that momentum. So, man, I really appreciate what you're doing.
Great, thank you. Happy to hear that.
Yeah. Good. Okay. One quick question from anybody. Now's your last chance. So, okay. Anything else, Sarah? Wrap up. I think we're about done here.
No, tune in next Tuesday. We'll be here.
Okay. Jen, anything else from you?
No, thank you guys. That does it for me.
All right. Well, we'll get this link out to you here as soon as I can, and appreciate all you joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Stay cool.
Thank you. You guys have a great evening.
All right.